I knew the moment my sister's voice sliced across the marble-floored ballroom that every head would turn toward me. Not because I was important, but because she wanted to make sure everyone knew I wasn't. "Excuse me, are you the help?" Sienna's tone was sugar dipped in venom, loud enough to echo off the chandeliers. "Staff should use the side entrance. You need to leave, immediately." For a second the room froze. The glittering crowd, the string quartet, the waiters holding silver trays mid-air. My parents stood 3 feet away, dressed like royalty in their tailored black tie outfits, and yet neither of them blinked, neither said a single word to stop her. My mother looked right through me as if I were a smudge on her evening. My father adjusted his cufflinks, pretending to study a display of champagne flutes. And the wife of the CEO hosting the gala let her gaze sweep over me. My plain black dress, my sensible heels, my pulled-back hair, as though I had tracked dirt in from the street. I stood very still, my fingers tightening around the clutch at my side, and for a moment I tasted metal, the familiar bitterness of being erased by the very people who claimed to be my family. But I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't remind anyone who I truly was. I simply turned toward the terrace doors, my heart pounding with something that wasn't humiliation anymore. It was patience reaching its final limit. The night air was cooler than I expected when I stepped outside. The city skyline flickered below the terrace like a restless sea of lights, each window a private world where no one knew the Hayes family's dirty little habit, pretending I wasn't one of them whenever it suited their image. I breathed in slowly, letting the sting ebb just long enough for clarity to settle. I pulled my phone from my clutch, tapped open the encrypted portal only 3 people in the entire corporation knew existed, and saw the notification waiting for me. Luminex Systems, emergency board meeting confirmed. $2 billion on the line. A contract that would change the infrastructure of half the country. And a CEO who would have no idea that the founding partner, demanding his presence at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, was the woman who had just been told to use the side entrance at his luxury gala. I slid the phone back into my clutch and walked inside again, but this time I didn't look toward my parents. I didn't look toward Sienna, still basking in the admiration of her designer-draped friends. I moved through the crowd like a shadow, the very thing they had trained me to be. A faint thread of conversation drifted toward me. Someone laughing about that poor girl who wandered in. Someone else guessing I was a temp who got confused. They had no idea the quiet woman slipping past them owned more than half of the company funding their precious event. Outside the hotel, I handed my valet ticket to a young attendant who treated me with more patience than my entire family had managed in 30 years. My modest sedan pulled forward, its headlights washing over the entrance where my parents stood greeting donors. I caught a glimpse of my mother's smile, the one she reserved for people she believed could elevate her status. Not once did she glance toward me. I slid behind the wheel, closed the door gently, and let the silence wrap around me like armor. The drive home cut through streets glistening with recent rain. Drops rolled down the windshield like beads of glass as I replayed the scene in my mind. Sienna's voice dripping with smug confidence, the CEO's wife laughing behind her hand, my parents pretending I didn't exist. Once upon a time, that would have hollowed me out. But tonight, something had shifted. The humiliation didn't burrow into me the way it used to. It didn't dim my sense of self. If anything, it sharpened my purpose. By the time I pulled into the underground garage beneath my building, the notification I'd been waiting for buzzed against my palm. CEO Rhodes has accepted your meeting request. Good. That meant tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. For him, for the executives who had grown complacent under his negligence, and for the version of myself my family still believed they controlled. I rode the elevator to my penthouse, a detail no one in my family knew, and one I intended to keep that way. The hallways were quiet, the air warm with the scent of cedar from the paneling I had chosen myself. Everything in that space came from my decisions, my labor, my vision. Not a single piece of it had come from family inheritance or parental generosity. I had learned long ago those were luxuries reserved for my sister. Inside, I kicked off my heels, poured myself a glass of water, and opened my laptop at the kitchen island. The documents for the $2 billion contract glowed on the screen. Pages and pages of technical architecture, compliance frameworks, predictive models. All mine. Every foundational layer of Luminex systems had come from long nights spent coding in a basement apartment while my parents funneled every spare dollar into Sienna's dance lessons, her wardrobe, her travel teams, her image. I looked at the city lights stretching to the horizon and let the truth I rarely said aloud fill my mind. If they had known what I was building, they would have tried to own it. If they had known what I was worth, they would have tried to diminish it. If they had known who I was becoming, they would have done everything in their power to make sure I never got here. My phone vibrated. A message from the family group chat lit the screen. Mom. Sienna looked stunning tonight. Everyone said she carried herself like a true haze. Dad. Morgan, we didn't see you. Did you leave early? I stared at the messages, the ones that told their own story. They noticed me only when I wasn't there. They asked questions only when they wanted to soothe their own image. I typed a reply but deleted it before it sent. There was no point explaining something they had no intention of understanding. Instead, I opened the secure channel once more and drafted the final agenda for the morning board meeting. Every executive, every division head, every board member, mandatory attendance, 8 a.m. sharp. I closed my laptop, feeling the weight in my chest loosen. For years, I had allowed my family's silence to shape the boundaries of my life, where I stood, how loudly I could speak, how much space I thought I deserved. But tonight, as rain whispered against the glass and the city drifted deeper into night, something inside me settled into place. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They had mistaken my patience for submission. And they had mistaken my absence for insignificance. Tomorrow morning, when I walked into that boardroom and took my seat at the head of the table, they would all learn what silence looks like when it finally stops apologizing. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the darkness, letting the hum of the city pulse against the windows. Then I whispered to the empty room, a promise, not a threat. You called me the help tonight, I said softly. Tomorrow, you'll call me the boss. I set my alarm for 5, slid under the cool sheets, and closed my eyes to the steady rhythm of rain. For once, my thoughts didn't spiral. My heart didn't twist itself into knots. I wasn't replaying memories of being overlooked at school assemblies, or the night my parents forgot to pick me up from debate club because Sienna had a hair appointment, or the countless times they spoke about my sister's bright future as though mine were a hobby. Tonight, I felt something else, something quiet but powerful. Readiness. The kind that comes after years of being underestimated and months of watching a company you built being steered into the shadows by someone unworthy. The kind that comes after being dismissed at your own family's table so many times you forget what it feels like to be seen. The kind that builds in a woman who has run out of reasons to stay small. When the alarm buzzed, it felt like waking into a different life. Pale morning light slipped through the curtains, brushing over the hardwood floors, like a soft reminder that this was no ordinary day. I brewed tea, the scent of bergamot rising in the air, and sat beside the window overlooking the city. Below, traffic was already moving, tiny headlights threading through the streets like veins of energy. It reminded me that the world kept turning no matter who believed in me, and that I had stopped waiting for validation long ago. At 6, I showered and pulled on a charcoal suit. Simple, precise, understated. Clothing had always been a way my family signaled importance, but I didn't need sequins or designer labels. I didn't need to look powerful to be powerful. My mind drifted back, not to last night's humiliation, but to the earlier years. The nights coding until sunrise in an apartment with water stains on the ceiling. The moment I realized my algorithm had made a breakthrough. The first investor meeting where a man twice my age asked if I was the assistant who brought the slides. The way it felt to sign incorporation papers while knowing no one in my family would ask how my day had been. I stepped into the private elevator that led directly to the executive floor. The metal doors slid shut, and my reflection stared back. Calm, composed, ready. There was something almost serene about knowing the pivot point of my life was minutes away. When the doors opened, the hallway was silent. The boardroom door stood at the end like a final threshold, the last barrier between who I had been and the woman I was choosing to be. The founding partner wants to discuss the $2 billion contract. I imagined Damon reading that line last night, imagining a figure older, male, wealthy from birth, someone molded by legacy. He would never suspect the woman he'd brushed past at the gala, the one who wore a simple black dress and didn't push back when humiliated. He would never imagine she was the architect of everything he stood on. I placed my hand on the boardroom door. Behind it waited executives who had overlooked me, a CEO who believed he owned the future, and a truth long overdue. And as I pushed the door open, a single thought moved through me like a steady flame. Let them underestimate me one last time. The sun was barely a smear of pale gold over the city when I stepped out of my building the next morning, my breath mixing with the cool air as I walked toward my car. I had slept less than 5 hours, but my mind felt sharper than it had in months. The humiliation from the gala still clung to me like the smell of expensive perfume that lingered too long, but something deeper, something steadier, had taken root underneath it. I wasn't going to run from last night. I was going to use it. As I drove through early morning traffic, streetlights blinking out one by one, I replayed the moment Sienna's voice rose above the string quartet, slicing into me in front of 200 guests. I could still hear the soft, embarrassed laughter of people assuming I was some underpaid staff member who had wandered into the wrong room. But what I felt now wasn't the familiar collapse of old wounds. It was clarity, cold and precise. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen when I stopped at a red light. A message from Priya. "You okay?" Heard the gala was dramatic. I exhaled slowly. Priya always seemed to know when something was off, even before I told her. She had been there from the beginning, one of the few people who knew exactly what I had built, exactly what I was worth, and exactly why I kept it hidden. I typed back quickly, "Fine. Big day ahead." The light turned green, and I let the message sit, unsent. Priya would understand. She always had. Traffic thinned as I reached the freeway, the city unfolding in front of me like a map I had drawn myself. The skyline glittered with possibilities and threats in equal measure. Every building, every corporate tower, every glass facade reminded me of the years I had spent building a world in which I could finally disappear on my own terms. I had chosen silence because I wanted control. Not invisibility, control. I exited near the University District, the same streets I had walked a decade ago with a backpack full of textbooks and a laptop that overheated every 30 minutes. The coffee shop where I used to spend nights debugging code was still there, its faded sign buzzing faintly in the morning breeze. I found a parking spot a block away and stepped out, breathing in the faint scent of roasted beans and wet pavement. Inside, the shop looked almost unchanged. Same scratched wooden tables, same flickering Edison bulbs, same students slumped over keyboards nursing cheap Americanos. I ordered a plain black coffee and settled into a corner table with my laptop, letting the rush of nostalgia sharpen my focus. For a moment, I could almost see the younger version of myself sitting across from me. Dark circles under her eyes, hair in a messy knot, typing lines of code like they were battle hymns. She had believed, stubbornly and without evidence, that she could build something world-changing if she just kept pushing. She had believed she could do it alone. And she had been right. The narrative used to be simple. I wrote the algorithm. I built the architecture. I turned a basement project into the backbone of a company that would one day land a $2 billion government contract. But the truth was messier, heavier, more human than that. I remembered the night it started. Kyle had burst into our study room, eyes wide behind his glasses. "Morgan, I think your predictive model could actually work on a national scale," he said, breathless. I had blinked at him, half-conscious from coding for 14 hours straight. "You're hallucinating." "No, really," he insisted. "If we refine the logic tree and optimize the data pipeline, we could build something revolutionary." He believed it more than I did. Priya did too. She sat down with her laptop and started sketching a prototype. The three of us worked until sunrise, fueled by caffeine, hope, and the reckless certainty that our lives were about to change. And they did, but not the way any of us expected. I sipped my coffee and opened the folder of archived files I rarely touched. Screenshots of our first prototypes, notes scribbled at 3 a.m, spreadsheets documenting the equity split. I stared at the line that had defined my life more than anything else. Ownership: Morgan Hayes, 54% Kyle Bennett, 23% Priya Shah, 23%. I remembered their insistence. "You wrote the base engine," Priya said. "This is yours." "No founder keeps majority," I protested. "It's not sustainable." Kyle shrugged. "You earned it." But earning came with a cost. It made me the target from day one. Target of investors who didn't like voting power in the hands of a woman. Target of senior researchers who assumed I was the intern. Target of the world that still believed women in tech were support roles. And it made me a target in my own family too, though they didn't know it yet. The first funding pitch was a disaster. A well-known investor leaned back in his chair, arms folded, studying me like I had grown an extra head. "You're the architect?" he asked Kyle, nodding toward him. Kyle shook his head. "She is." The investor turned to me, incredulous. "Her?" Priya slammed her pen down. "Yes, her. The one who wrote the code you just said was the most promising model you've seen in 5 years. The investor's expression tightened. "I prefer working with founders who project confidence. Male-led teams tend to—" "I'm not selling you me," I said, startling myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I'm selling you a product you can't find anywhere else." We didn't get that investment, but I kept the majority anyway, and it became my shield. The coffee shop noise blended into the background as I continued reviewing old files. Legal contracts, non-disclosure agreements, the first Luminex Systems letterhead. I knew exactly why I had chosen to stay anonymous all these years. Because the moment people knew what I owned, they would try to take it, control it, twist it into something they could claim credit for. My father's voice drifted into my mind, one of his favorite lines from childhood dinners. "A family is only as strong as its head." He always said it while looking at Sienna, never at me. I rubbed a hand over my jaw, trying to shake off the memories, and opened a new window with the internal memo list. Every major decision in the past 5 years had passed through my hands, even the ones Damon took credit for. The energy model, the freight routing logic, the system security upgrade. The entire platform was my fingerprint. And yet no one outside a tiny circle knew. A notification appeared at the corner of my screen. Damon had sent a memo at midnight. My jaw clenched as I opened it. Subject: Founder Presence. Message: The founding partner will be joining the meeting tomorrow. We expect everyone to uphold the highest professional standards. Any attempt to disrupt the agenda will be addressed immediately. Damon was nervous. Very nervous. I leaned back in my chair, letting a small, cold smile settle across my face. He was right to be nervous. He had built his entire reputation on leading a company whose foundation he didn't fully understand. He was a figurehead. I had allowed him to be one. His confidence came from believing he owned the spotlight. But I had never wanted the spotlight, only the power that came with choosing when to step into it. An hour passed before I looked at the clock and realized I needed to start heading toward campus. There was one more stop I needed to make before going to Luminex. One more glimpse into the past before I rewrote the future. The building where we had started Luminex was still standing. Just 3 floors, brick exterior, windows that didn't quite shut all the way. The sign at the front had changed. New tenants, new businesses. But the doorway was the same one we had walked through 100 times, full of ideas and too little sleep. I pressed my palm against the cool metal handle and closed my eyes. I could almost smell the instant ramen we ate for weeks, the acrid burn of overheated circuits, the faint trace of despair that clung to us before the breakthrough finally came. I could hear our laughter, our arguments, our desperate hope that someone, anyone, would see the value in what we were building. The world had seen it, just not the people I came from. I walked along the sidewalk, letting my thoughts drift. My family had always been outwardly supportive in the most performative way possible, proud to say they had a daughter in tech, but never curious enough to ask what that meant. They attended Sienna's dance competitions religiously, but forgot my college graduation until I sent them a picture after the ceremony. They told people I was good with computers, the same way someone might describe a child who finally learned to tie their shoes, and yet, last night, they didn't even bother pretending. Staff should use the side entrance. I felt a flicker of heat pulse through me. Not anger. Something older than that. Something ancestral. Something that came from years of being told that my worth was conditional on how small I stayed. I walked back to my car and drove toward Luminex headquarters. The tower rose into the sky like a glass needle, reflecting the morning light in sharp angles. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost personal. I had helped design the blueprint for the original structure, quietly, anonymously, the same way I had done everything else. Inside the lobby, employees moved quickly, their badges flashing against security panels. I blended in easily. No one suspected the woman walking past them owned more than half the building they worked in. A security guard I trusted nodded at me. "Morning, Miss Hayes." Even hearing it still felt like a secret. My name wasn't on any public registry, not on any Luminex marketing, not on any company press release. But the people who needed to know, knew. And soon, everyone else would too. I headed toward the elevators, tapping my badge. As the doors slid shut, I felt the quiet settle around me again. The same quiet I had built my career inside of. The same quiet my family had mistaken for weakness. The elevator rose steadily, floor by floor, carrying me toward the life I had created without anyone's permission. Today was the last day I would move through Luminex unseen. By tomorrow morning, every person who had ever dismissed me, my CEO, my board, and yes, even my own blood, would understand exactly who I was, and why I had stopped apologizing for it. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor with a soft hiss, the kind that always made me feel like the building itself was exhaling. I stepped out, heels clicking against the polished stone, and the silence of the hall wrapped around me like a familiar cloak. No one else had arrived yet. Not the board members, not the executives, not Damon with his expensive watch and hollow confidence. It was just me and the hum of the climate system, steady as a heartbeat. I walked past the frosted glass offices, each one dark, each door marked with titles that once meant everything to me. Chief Operations Officer, Chief Technology Officer, Senior Strategy Director. When I was younger, I thought titles were proof that someone had been chosen. Now I knew they were often proof that someone had been noticed. There was a difference. I had spent most of my adult life being the one who wasn't noticed, and yet every blueprint behind these walls had my fingerprints on it. When I reached the boardroom, I unlocked the door with my private access code. The lights brightened automatically, illuminating the long mahogany table and the wide screen mounted to the wall. A faint smell of lemon polish hung in the air. I walked to the head of the table, the seat no one sat in unless summoned, and set my bag down. Then I opened my laptop and began arranging the documents for the meeting. Every line of the agenda had been chosen carefully. The $2 billion contract, the upcoming cybersecurity overhaul, the financial irregularities I intended to confront, the cultural problems festering under Damon's leadership. It was all there, threaded together with calm precision. I had been preparing for this moment long before last night's humiliation pushed me past my breaking point. My phone buzzed. A message from Priya. "Call me if you need a distraction before the fireworks." I smiled briefly before replying, You'll hear the fireworks from wherever you are." As I set my phone down, the elevator dinged in the hallway. Footsteps approached, rapid and purposeful. A moment later, Val from corporate compliance stepped inside the boardroom, her expression a mix of nerves and curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," she said softly. The title always made me pause. Miss Hayes. Not Morgan, not you there, not staff. She was one of the few who knew the truth, that the founder no one had ever seen was the woman who dressed in neutrals, sat quietly in the back rows, and rarely spoke unless she had to. "Morning, Val," I said. She hesitated, hands tightening around the folder she carried. "I heard about the gala last night. Are you all right?" The instinct to lie rose immediately. Tell her I was fine, that I'd brushed it off, that it didn't matter. But the truth was different. The truth mattered today more than any other. "Last night clarified a lot," I said. "That's all." She nodded, her gaze full of something like respect. "They won't see this coming." "No," I agreed, "they won't." One by one, the rest of the senior staff filtered in. Heads of engineering, logistics, operations, internal audit. Some looked tense, some curious, some wary. A few avoided my eyes, as if unsure whether they should greet me the way they always did, or treat me like a stranger. Their confusion was understandable. For 5 years, the founder had been a rumor, a myth, a silent guardian who approved budgets and denied proposals with unemotional precision. No one ever imagined the founder was a 30-year-old woman in a quiet suit with her hair still damp from an early morning shower. Damon was the last to arrive. Of course he was. Late enough to establish dominance, early enough to look responsible. He strode into the boardroom with his usual charisma, scanning the table like an actor checking his lighting. "Morgan," he said, stopping beside me. "You're here early." "So are you," I replied. He chuckled, misreading the dryness in my voice. "Well, I'd be a fool to be late to a meeting called by the founder. Big day." He had shaved carefully, probably chosen his most expensive cologne, adjusted his tie 3 times on the drive over. He was preparing for the meeting he thought he was walking into, the one where he charmed the mysterious founder and secured his position for another quarter. He had no idea the meeting he wanted was not the meeting he was about to get. The room settled as people took their seats. Damon stood near the head of the table, ready to begin with his usual performative confidence. I could feel the anticipation, the energy tightening like a drawn bowstring. I closed my laptop. The soft click drew every eye to me. "Before we begin," I said, "there's something you all need to see." Damon blinked. "We should review the agenda first." "No," I said calmly. "We shouldn't." I tapped the remote. The screen behind me lit up with a document none of them had ever seen with their own eyes, one they had only heard whispers about. Luminex Systems, Inc., Founding Partner Agreement. Majority ownership, 52% name. Morgan Elise Hayes, silence. The kind of silence that becomes a physical presence. The kind of silence that feels like a heartbeat stopping. I watched the realization ripple across the table. Val's lips parted slightly in awe. The head of operations leaned forward, confused. The legal counsel blinked hard, as if her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. But Damon... Damon's reaction was almost delicate. A tremor in his jaw, a flicker behind his eyes. Not confusion, not disbelief. Something closer to fear. "This," he said, voice tight. "This has to be some kind of joke." "It isn't," I said. He shook his head slowly, a veneer of denial creeping through his expression. No, the founder is a foreign investor. Or a consortium. Or, I said, you made assumptions based on what you expected to see. And you were wrong." A ripple moved through the room. Damon took a step back, as if distance could change the words on the screen. He was losing control of the narrative, something he had never allowed to happen. "You've been hiding this?" he snapped. "From everyone? From me?" "I hid it from the people who needed to prove they could lead without being watched," I said. "Some succeeded, some did not." He looked like he wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. "You can't just walk in here and—" I raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. "I can," I said, "because I built this company, because I wrote the architecture you take credit for, because every expansion you bragged about was approved by me, and because I own the majority shareholding that keeps this company alive." Someone at the far end of the table whispered, "Holy hell." Damon swallowed. "You blindsided us." I looked him dead in the eye. "Last night you stood not 10 feet from me at your own gala and let your wife mock me. You let my sister humiliate me. You let my parents pretend they didn't know me. And that tells me everything I need to know about your leadership." Heads turned sharply toward him. His composure wavered. "This is personal," he hissed. "No," I said, "but your behavior made it necessary." I clicked to the next slide. A list of failures, his failures, revenue stagnation, employee turnover spikes, harassment complaints, security breaches quietly buried, unauthorized expenses, misuse of company funds, violation of compliance standards, $2 billion contract at risk. Each line hit him like a blow. "This is slander," he stammered. "You're twisting." "I have documentation," I said, "from every department you ignored, every employee you dismissed, every problem you covered up." People shifted in their seats, murmuring. Someone whispered, "We reported that last year." Another muttered, "She knew everything." Damon stepped forward, palms flat on the table. "You have no right to—" "I have every right," I said quietly. "I've had it since the day this company was formed. I simply chose not to use it." The weight of the words filled the room. Someone from engineering raised a hesitant hand. "Miss Hayes, what happens now?" I turned to the room fully, no longer looking at Damon. "Luminex is going to change," I said. "Starting today." I clicked to the next slide. Immediate actions. CEO placed under administrative review. Interim leadership installed. Ethics committee formed. Anonymous reporting reinstated. Contract oversight transferred to founding partner authority. Board restructuring pending. The room erupted. Damon paled. "You can't do this." "I already have." He stared at me, breathing unevenly, hands shaking slightly. "You're ruining everything we built." "No," I said softly. "I'm saving everything I built." A hush fell again. Then, slowly, cautiously, the head of cybersecurity began to clap. One person, then another, and another. In seconds, half the table was applauding lightly, not in celebration, but in recognition. Relief, hope. Damon looked around, seeing loyalty shifting like sand beneath him. I closed the presentation and stepped aside. "Please take your seats," I said. "We'll begin the meeting now." Damon stayed frozen, jaw clenched. "This isn't over." "For your sake," I said. "I hope you're wrong." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Decisions were made, directives issued, a new chapter set into motion. When it ended, people lingered to shake my hand, thank me, offer cautious words of support. No one approached Damon. He slipped out quietly, shoulders tense, phone already in hand as he began damage control. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone at the head of the table. The sun had risen fully now, flooding the windows with light. For the first time in years, that light felt like it belonged to me. And the world I had built, quietly, carefully, invisibly, was no longer something I had to hide. Tomorrow, the entire corporate world would know my name, and soon, my family would too. The moment I stepped out of the boardroom, the air in the hallway felt charged, almost electric. Conversations hushed as I passed. People who normally brushed by me without a second glance were suddenly standing taller, adjusting their badges, offering cautious nods as though unsure how to greet the woman they had unknowingly worked under for years. I kept walking, steady and quiet, letting the shift settle around me like a second skin. In the elevator, alone again, the silence felt heavier than before, not oppressive, but anticipatory. Everything that happened in that boardroom was only the first step. The real battle, the one that had been simmering for decades, was waiting for me far beyond corporate walls. I drove home through a city that looked different now, as if every window, every street, every shadow knew a secret no one else had caught up to yet. By the time I reached my penthouse, my shoulders ached with the weight of everything I had held tight for so long, but my mind remained painfully alert. I had barely closed the front door when my phone buzzed relentlessly. Missed calls, texts, voice messages, all from my family. I didn't open any of them. Not yet. Instead, I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and walked toward the window, letting the fading sunlight pour across the floorboards. The quiet inside my apartment felt like a balm, the kind that reminded me why I'd built my life alone. Why I had kept everything I created far from people who would have tried to own it. My childhood had taught me that love in my family came with strings that could choke. I had spent years cutting each one carefully, silently. Today, I had severed the final thread. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message from my mother flashed on the screen. "Morgan, call us. This is urgent." I locked the screen and set the phone face down. Urgent, in her vocabulary, always meant one thing: control was slipping. I sat on the couch, sipping the last of a lukewarm glass of water, and for a moment the exhaustion crept in. The kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from decades of being unseen. My mind drifted, unbidden, toward memories I rarely let surface. The years before Luminex. The years before I understood that invisibility was not my identity. It was a role they had assigned me. I saw myself at 10 years old standing backstage at one of Sienna's dance recitals. She was glowing in sequins, surrounded by other girls in identical costumes. My mother knelt at her feet adjusting the ribbons on her ballet shoes, while my father snapped pictures like paparazzi. I had stood there in my plain dress, holding the garment bag she'd tossed at me when she'd rushed off to warm-ups. "Can you just carry this?" she'd said, barely looking at me. My mother didn't ask about my day. My father didn't ask what I wanted. I was simply part of the scenery, there to be helpful, not to be seen. Later that evening, while celebrating Sienna's performance with dinner at her favorite restaurant, my father told her she was destined for greatness. My mother said she would change the world. I remembered raising my hand timidly. I got first place in the regional coding competition today. They had both blinked at me like I'd interrupted something important. "That's nice, sweetheart," my mother said, before turning back to Sienna. "So as I was saying, your pirouettes were just stunning." They didn't even ask what I'd built, didn't ask how hard I'd worked, didn't ask why I'd been quiet all evening. At the time, the hurt had felt sharp and personal. As an adult, I recognized it for what it was: conditioning. A lifetime of being told, through silence and selective affection, that I existed to fill in the background of someone else's story. The doorbell rang, jolting me from the memory. I froze. No one ever visited me without calling first. No one in my personal life except Priya or Kyle even knew my address. And my family certainly didn't know where I lived. At least, they weren't supposed to. The doorbell rang a second time. Longer, sharper. I set down my glass and walked to the door, keeping my steps soft, controlled. I peered through the peephole and felt my stomach harden. Sienna. Full makeup. Perfect hair. Designer coat. But her expression, the tightness around her eyes, the stiffness in her jaw, wasn't rehearsed. She looked furious. She also looked frightened. I unlocked the door but didn't open it wide. She pushed inside anyway. "Are you out of your mind?" she snapped, heels clicking angrily against the hardwood as she strode into my living room. "What did you do today? What were you thinking?" I shut the door slowly, giving myself a long moment before I turned to face her. "What I had to do," I said evenly. "You humiliated us." She spun around, eyes flashing. "Dad nearly fainted when he heard the news. Mom was sobbing. Damon looked like he'd been punched in the throat. And you just stood there acting like the Queen of New York." I blinked once, absorbing her theatrics silently. "Is that what bothers you?" I asked. That I stood there? What bothers me, she said, stepping closer, is that you made us look like idiots. You let people believe we didn't know our own family. You blindsided us. I didn't blindside anyone, I said quietly. You never bothered to look. She scoffed. Oh, here we go, the martyr speech. I inhaled slowly through my nose. Why are you here, Sienna? She hesitated for the first time, her bravado slipping. Because... She rubbed her arms, narrowing her eyes at me. Because people are asking questions. Dad's on the phone with the board. Mom is calling every person she knows. Everyone is trying to figure out how this happened. How what happened? How you became the founder of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I didn't become it, I said calmly. I built it. She stared at me, her expression flickering with disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that's not possible. You were never like that. You weren't... A threat? I asked. A leader, she shot back. You didn't act like one. I felt something ancient and tired uncoil inside me. I didn't act the way you expected, I corrected. There's a difference. She swallowed hard, mascara-darkened lashes lowering for a moment. When she looked up again, there was something raw in her expression. Something I had rarely seen in her eyes. Fear. You made us look like fools, she repeated, but her voice lacked force now. You did that yourselves, I said. Silence stretched between us, a thick, heavy presence filling the room. She shifted her weight, folding her arms tightly around herself as though bracing against something she couldn't name. Mom wants you to call her, she said finally. Dad, too. They said you need to fix this. No, her brows lifted sharply. No, that's all you have to say? That's all. She stared at me, stunned. You can't just refuse. This is our family, our reputation. I cut her off. You mean your reputation, your spotlight, your comfort. You sound insane. No, I said softly. For the first time, I sound like someone who isn't afraid. She froze, and I saw it clearly then. Her shock wasn't just about the company or the power or the money. It was about the shift in me, the boundaries I had drawn without her permission, the confidence she didn't recognize because she had spent her entire life living above me, not beside me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Well, she said eventually, voice tight, you should know that the board is considering intervening. Damon is furious. They're talking about calling an emergency meeting. I know, I said. She blinked. You know? I do. I also know they can't override a majority shareholder. She stared at me as if she'd swallowed ice. This isn't over, she whispered. For your sake, I said quietly. I hope it is. She snatched her bag off the armchair and stormed toward the door, but just before she left, she turned back, eyes narrow with something that wasn't quite anger anymore. Mom thinks you did all this to punish us. I didn't, I said. I did it to protect what I built. And what about us? She demanded. I met her gaze steadily. You were never protecting me. She flinched. Actually flinched. Then the door slammed behind her. Silence flooded the apartment again, thick and strange. I leaned back against the wall, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from release, the kind of trembling that comes after truth finally leaves your body. My phone buzzed again, this time a single message from my father. We need to talk. Tonight. No excuses. I set the phone down without replying. Not tonight. Tonight I needed space from the world I had spent so long trying to escape from. I walked to the window, looking out over the city. Cars moved like tiny insects along the avenues, and the glow of office towers reminded me that somewhere out there, people were building things of their own. And somewhere out there, my family was scrambling to reorder a hierarchy that no longer existed. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and let my breathing slow. Tomorrow, the corporate fallout would begin. Tomorrow, the family fallout would intensify. Tomorrow, everything I had buried would surface. But tonight, I let myself feel the quiet. A quiet that wasn't emptiness. A quiet that felt like coming home to myself. I woke before dawn, the echo of last night's confrontation still vibrating through my chest. For the first time in a long time, my dreams were quiet. No shadow of my parents' disappointed looks, no replay of my sister's condescension, no flicker of self-doubt that used to gnaw at me before sunrise. Just silence. A clean, new kind of silence. I made tea and sat near the large window overlooking the city. It was still dark enough that the lights below looked like scattered constellations, each tiny glow marking a life I didn't know. Somewhere down there, my family was waking up too. My parents probably pacing the kitchen, Sienna rehearsing new angles of outrage, and all of them scrambling to figure out how everything slipped out of their hands overnight. I took a slow sip and let the warmth steady me. Today wasn't about them, it was about preparing the company for what came next. It was about stepping fully into the power I had spent years hiding. And it was about making sure Damon didn't sabotage anything in his panic. By 7, I was dressed in a navy suit sharp enough to cut through doubt. I pulled my hair back, put on minimal makeup, and grabbed my leather folder, the same one I used to carry as a graduate student taking contract law classes at night. Back then, I had been preparing for a future I barely believed could happen. Now I walked into that future like it was simply the next meeting on my calendar. When I arrived at Luminex headquarters, the building buzzed with a strange mixture of tension and awe. Conversations dipped in volume as I passed. People who had ignored me for years now stared openly, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman they learned about yesterday. A young engineer holding a coffee cup nearly dropped it when he saw me. "Miss Hayes," he stammered, "I just wanted to say, thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For everything. For finally saying what so many of us were afraid to." He swallowed hard. It felt like someone opened a window. The honesty in his voice hit somewhere deep. I nodded. "Thank you for telling me." As I stepped into the elevator, I saw my reflection. Calm, composed, no trace of the girl who used to shrink under her family's absence. The doors closed, sealing me inside the quiet ascent to the executive floor. When they opened, my assistant, Leah, stood waiting with a tablet in her hands and a nervous sort of excitement in her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. I have the list of executives ready for one-on-one meetings. Everyone's confirmed attendance." "How many are nervous?" I asked. Her lips twitched. "Most of them." "Good," I said. "They should be." She hid a smile and walked with me toward my temporary office, where stacks of reports, financial audits, and employee statements were arranged neatly on my desk. I didn't sit right away. Instead, I stood at the window overlooking the city. The skyline was clearer now, full morning light making everything look sharper, more vivid. This was my world, my company, my decisions. And for the first time, no one else could take that from me. Leah cleared her throat. "Your 9 o'clock is here." "Send them in." The next hours unfolded with surgical precision. I spoke with department heads, listened to senior engineers, reviewed compliance reports. Some executives were supportive, some were cautious. A few tried to salvage alliances with Damon by pretending not to understand the gravity of his failures. But one meeting stopped me cold. The head of HR, a man named Carlton, walked into my office with a folder clutched in his hand so tightly the edges bent inward. "Miss Hayes," he began, sitting stiffly, "I believe there is information you need to see." I gestured for him to continue. He opened the folder and slid a stack of complaints toward me. "These are the harassment reports," he said quietly. "The ones your predecessor discouraged us from escalating." I flipped through them slowly. Line after line of testimony from women and men who had spoken up and been silenced, their concerns minimized, their dignity disregarded. "How many did Damon suppress?" I asked. Carlton swallowed hard. "At least 17. My jaw tightened. 17 people had been ignored while Damon smoothed edges and polished his public image. 17 stories he had buried because they were inconvenient. I closed the folder with deliberate care. "Thank you," I said. "Effective immediately, the ethics committee will take over." "And Carlton?" "Yes, Miss Hayes. You will never again be asked to keep silent." A tremor of relief crossed his face. "Thank you." After he left, I let myself breathe deeply, letting the weight of responsibility settle. I hadn't built Luminex to become another corporate machine that crushed the vulnerable. I had built it because I believed in something better. My 11 o'clock meeting arrived. Chloe, one of the software architects, walked in hesitantly. I remembered her well, sharp mind, meticulous work ethic, but always overlooked because she didn't make noise. She sat down, twisting her hands in her lap. "Miss Hayes, I wanted to tell you something." I leaned forward. "Go ahead." "When the founder," she corrected herself, "when you pushed the predictive routing upgrade last year, Damon told the team it was his idea." My lips tightened. I had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was still a visceral blow. "He dismissed the credit claims," she continued. "He sent out memos saying the leadership vision came from him, and when Priya tried to correct it, he told her it wasn't worth the conflict." Priya didn't tell me that part. She had probably been trying to protect me. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. Chloe nodded, eyes shining. "It felt like someone finally saw us yesterday." When she left, I stood for a moment, letting the truth settle heavily in my chest. Damon hadn't just been incompetent. He had been rewriting history, piece by piece, erasing my contributions in the shadows to preserve his illusion of leadership. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Tonight. This is not optional." "Dad," I turned the screen off. Not yet. By afternoon, the office buzzed with a different energy. Executives moved more alertly. Junior employees whispered to each other in the hallways, glancing around with hope instead of dread. Even the air felt lighter, as though the building had been waiting years for permission to breathe. At 3, Leah knocked gently on my door. "Miss Hayes, your 3:30 just arrived." I nodded. "Send him in." The door opened, and my breath caught, not with fear, not with surprise, but with something far more complex. Kyle stood there, the last person I expected to see. His hair was a little longer, his suit slightly rumpled, his eyes tired but focused. It had been years since we worked together daily, years since he'd handed over his portion of the company and chosen a quieter life. But seeing him brought back those early mornings in the basement, the nights debugging code until we couldn't see straight, the belief we had all shared, that what we were building could change the world. "Morgan," he said softly. "Kyle." He walked in slowly, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled deeply. "I heard about the boardroom." "News travels fast," I said. "Not fast enough." He smiled faintly. "You should have called me." "I've been busy." "I figured." His expression softened. "Congratulations, you know. On all of it." I studied him. "You're not here just to congratulate me." "No," he admitted. "I came to say I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than I expected. My eyes stung unexpectedly, and I looked away. "You always were," I murmured. "And I always will be." He stepped forward. "But Morgan, what happens next? Are you ready for the fallout?" "I've been ready for years," I said. He studied me carefully, the way only someone who had seen me at my lowest could. "You don't owe them anything." "I know. But part of you still wants them to understand." I swallowed hard. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then talk to them when you're ready, not when they demand it." I exhaled. "Thank you." He walked toward the door, paused, and looked back. "And Morgan, don't forget who you were before all this." I tilted my head. Who was I? "A girl who believed she could build the impossible," he said. "And did." When he left, the silence in my office felt different. Not empty, but grounded. By the time I wrapped up meetings and prepared to leave, the sky outside had turned shades of orange and deep purple. The city glowed like a live wire. I gathered my things and walked slowly toward the elevator, letting the quiet of the evening settle over me. My phone buzzed again, my father calling. I let it ring, then ring again, then fall silent. Tomorrow maybe, I would answer. Tonight. I wanted stillness. I stepped into the elevator and exhaled slowly as the doors slid shut. This was only the beginning. I pulled into my parking garage just after 6, the soft hum of the engine fading while the weight of the day settled over me like dust. The sky outside had faded to a muted lavender, the kind of early evening glow that made the city look almost gentle. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and walked toward the elevator, each step echoing louder than the last. I thought maybe I'd have an hour to breathe, to process everything that had happened at Luminex, to sit quietly with my own thoughts before diving into the next fire waiting to ignite. But the moment I stepped out of the elevator on my floor, I realized how naive that hope was. My door was ajar, not wide open, just a sliver of light escaping into the hallway, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly how the latch clicked shut. I stopped dead in my tracks. My pulse quickened, but my body stilled, instinct overriding exhaustion. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, just my own sharp breathing and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I approached the door slowly, pushed it fully open with my fingertips, and stepped inside. My father was sitting on my couch. He stood the moment he saw me, tightening his jaw as if bracing for a collision. "You weren't answering your phone," he said. "And you decided breaking into my home was the solution?" I asked, setting my keys down carefully. "I asked the doorman to let me up," he corrected. "He recognizes me." Of course he did. My father had a way of making people feel they had no right to say no. Authority radiated off him the way heat radiates from asphalt in August. The doorman would have felt cornered, even if he didn't mean to. I took a slow breath. "Why are you here, Dad?" He didn't sit back down. Instead, he stood stiffly by the coffee table, staring at me with the same assessing gaze he used when coaching Sienna through her competitions. Critical, expectant, never once curious about who I was. "We need to talk," he said. I set my bag on the counter and turned toward him. I figured. "You blindsided us," he began, voice tight with contained anger. "Humiliated us. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "Yes," I said, "accurate." He glared at me. "This isn't funny." "Wasn't trying to be." "And you didn't think to tell your own family?" he demanded. "That you were the founder? That you owned half the company? That you've been manipulating things behind the scenes?" "Manipulating," I repeated slowly. "You think being the silent partner in my own company is manipulation?" "You kept secrets. You never asked." "That's not the point," he snapped. "It's the entire point." His nostrils flared. "Enough. This behavior stops now. Whatever damage you caused today, you're going to fix it. You're going to call the board. You're going to clarify things. You're going—" "I'm not doing any of that." His voice dropped dangerously low. "Morgan, do not test me." I let out a humorless laugh. "You really still think you can order me around, after everything?" He didn't flinch. "I am your father. And I am the majority shareholder of a corporation worth billions. You think that gives you power over me? I think it finally gives me power over myself." The silence that followed hit harder than his shouting ever could. My father ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older, worn around the edges. Then he shook his head, pacing in front of my window. "Your mother has been sick with worry. Sienna's distraught. Damon's furious. Everyone is confused, ashamed, blindsided. You didn't consider us at all." I swallowed the swell of old hurt tightening in my throat. "No," I said quietly. "For once I considered me." He turned sharply. "And what about us?" I stared at him, feeling the all-too-familiar burn of bitterness rising. "You didn't think about me last night at the gala when Mom pretended she didn't know me. When Sienna called me staff. When Damon's wife laughed at me while you all looked away. Did you consider me then? That was a misunderstanding, he said quickly. An unfortunate moment. A moment, I said softly. That summed up 30 years. His jaw flexed. You're being dramatic. No, I said, just honest. His eyes narrowed. You think you're better than us now? I think, I said steadily, that I finally know I'm not less. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen to me carefully. You are going to fix this. You do not destroy your family's reputation to prove a point. I didn't destroy anything, I said. You're just experiencing consequences for the first time. He stiffened. This isn't you. You're not this person. My throat tightened. Maybe you never knew who I was. He paused, thrown off. It was the first crack I had seen in his certainty. He swallowed, trying again. Just talk to your mother. She's devastated. I don't doubt that. I kept my voice calm. But devastation doesn't erase patterns. It doesn't undo the way you treated me my whole life. We treated you the way we treated Sienna, he insisted. My laugh cracked out sharp and cold. No, you treated me like an afterthought. You treated her like the sun. That's not true. Dad, I cut in. When I got a full scholarship for graduate school, Mom congratulated Sienna on landing a commercial, the same night. He opened his mouth, closed it again. And when I won the national coding competition, I continued quietly, you said, and I quote, "That's nice, sweetheart. Can you pick your sister up from rehearsal?" His shoulders tensed, and something in his eyes flickered. Memory, maybe, or guilt. And when the University of Chicago invited me to speak, I said, Mom said she couldn't make it because she had to help Sienna choose a dress for the spring formal. That was years ago, he muttered weakly, and the pattern never changed. He pressed a hand to the edge of the couch as if steadying himself. Families make mistakes. Yes, I said, but mistakes require acknowledgement. My father didn't speak for several seconds. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. I talked to 3 people today, he said quietly. All of them asked why we didn't raise you the way you turned out, why we didn't support you, why we didn't know who you were. I clenched my jaw. And what did you say? That we made sacrifices for you, he said stiffly. That we gave you a home, that we— No, I whispered. You sacrificed me for convenience. You gave me a house, not a home. His jaw clenched again. Your sister is hurting. She's hurting, I said, because her version of me, the version she could control, no longer exists. His brows lowered. You owe her a conversation. I owe her nothing. He stepped closer. You owe your family everything. No, I said, voice low. I owe myself everything. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The tension stretched so tightly between us I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, he said, If you walk away from this family, don't expect to come back. I took a deep, steady breath. I walked away years ago, I said. You just didn't notice. His face went pale with a kind of stunned anger I'd never seen before. He looked at me the way he might look at a stranger, one he didn't understand, one he didn't trust. Then he grabbed his coat and walked to the door. You'll regret this, he said. I lifted my chin. Not as much as I would regret staying. He left without another word. The moment the door shut, my knees felt weak. I walked slowly into the center of the living room and let myself sink onto the couch, elbows propped on my knees, hands pressed against my face. My father's words echoed through the room like ghostly versions of all the things he never said when I was growing up. Pride, support, love. The silence afterward was louder than the confrontation. My phone buzzed again. Mom, please, come home. We can fix this. Then another. Sienna. I can't believe you talked to Dad like that. What's wrong with you? I blocked her number without hesitation. Then I silenced my phone, stood up, and walked to the window. The city lights blurred through the glass, golden and soft, a world moving forward whether my family did or not. Behind me, on the table, the folder containing today's restructuring decisions sat open, names, roles, next steps. Ahead of me, another confrontation waited. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small or intimidated. I felt ready to finish what I started, ready to stop carrying the weight of people who had never carried me, ready to rebuild my life the way it should have been all along, not in their shadow, but in my own light. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear or regret or second-guessing. Those old companions had finally loosened their grip on me. I stayed awake because my mind wouldn't stop sharpening itself, carving the next steps with a clarity so precise it felt like a blade. The confrontation with my father replayed in flashes, not as something that wounded me, but as something that confirmed what I had always known deep down. There was no version of this story where my family understood me without being forced to. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn their love with the quietest parts of myself. Now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let the loud parts come forward. By the time dawn bruised the sky with pale blues, I had already dressed, packed a stack of files into my briefcase, and brewed a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The scent filled the apartment as I moved around the kitchen, grounding myself in the knowledge that the day ahead would be heavier than most. Not because of the work. Luminex needed direction and I could give it, but because of the inevitable chaos my family would unleash now that they realized I wasn't bending. My phone buzzed once, then twice, then again. I didn't look, not yet. Instead, I headed out, locking the door behind me with a finality that settled deep into my bones. My heels echoed down the hallway, carrying me toward the elevator, toward the next phase of the storm I had chosen to walk through. Traffic was thicker than usual, a restless morning energy pulsing through the city. I pulled into Luminex headquarters, parked in the underground garage, and took the private elevator up to the executive floor. As the doors opened, I stepped into a corridor buzzing with anticipation. The employees weren't whispering out of fear today. They were whispering because something had shifted. Something had woken up. And it wasn't just me. As I walked toward my office, a junior analyst named Reed slowed his pace beside me. He'd always been shy, avoiding eye contact, mumbling in meetings, but today he looked directly at me. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "I wanted to say thank you." I glanced at him. "For what?" "For not letting them get away with it," he said. "For doing what the rest of us were too afraid to. We've needed this change for a long time." His honesty touched something inside me I didn't know was still tender. I nodded. "Thank you for saying that." He gave a small smile and hurried off, almost embarrassed by his own bravery. My assistant, Leah, was waiting outside my office with a tablet in her hands. "Good morning," she said. "Your morning schedule shifted. There's been activity." I raised an eyebrow. "From which direction?" She hesitated. "All of them." She handed me the tablet and I scrolled through the notifications. Board member chat. Urgent CEO internal statement. Drafted without approval. Anonymous tips submitted to Ethics Committee Security Alert Report at front desk. Several visitor requests. Denied family member attempted contact through reception. I stopped at the last one. "Which family member?" I asked. She winced slightly. "Your mother. She tried to come up without an appointment." "Of course she did." "Security followed protocol," she added. "They turned her away." "Good," I said quietly. I walked into my office, closed the door, and let myself exhale. The city sprawled out behind the glass wall, morning light glinting off skyscrapers like polished steel. I set down my bag, opened my briefcase, and pulled out the file labeled Culture Restructuring. Before I could even sit, a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened slowly, and Priya stepped inside. For a moment, I felt the familiar warmth in my chest, the comfort of seeing someone who knew me before the world had taken its first bite out of me. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she still had that look of fierce intelligence softened by genuine kindness. "You didn't call," she said. I wasn't ready. I know, she replied. That's why I came. She closed the door and walked toward me, eyes scanning my face. You okay? She asked softly. I considered lying, but what was the point? She saw too much, always had. I will be, I said. She nodded like she understood the space between those words. Then she set her bag down and perched on the edge of my desk. I heard about your dad showing up last night, she said. Are you all right after that? I leaned back against the window. He didn't come to understand. He came to control. He always has, she murmured. I felt a bitter laugh escape. Not anymore. She studied me for a long moment. You know this isn't just a storm, it's a shift. I know. And once you walk fully into this version of yourself, there's no going back. I don't want to go back. She smiled gently. Good. We talked for another few minutes, about the board, about Damon's frantic attempts to salvage his position, about the anonymous messages flooding the ethics inbox now that people finally believed someone was listening. But then Priya asked something I didn't expect. How are you feeling? Not as a founder, not as an executive, but as you? The question hit deeper than any accusation my father had thrown at me. I swallowed slowly. I'm tired, I admitted. But not the old tired, not the kind that comes from shrinking myself. This is the tired that comes right before a breakthrough. She smiled softly. Then lean into it. I nodded. I intend to. Before she left, she squeezed my hand. You're not alone in this, Morgan. Not anymore. The truth of that settled around me like a warm blanket. For years, I believed invisibility was the only way to keep my power safe. Now I realized power shared with the right people is power strengthened. After Priya left, I dove into work, reviewing department reports, signing compliance directives, drafting transition plans. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The building vibrated with the energy of change. But then, chaos erupted outside my office. Raised voices, footsteps, a security transmission crackling. I stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. 2 security officers stood at the far end of the corridor, blocking the path of my mother. Her face was red, her eyes swollen, her hands trembling, not with grief, but with fury. "Morgan!" she shouted when she saw me. "We are going to talk, right now." The officers tensed, unsure how to proceed. I raised a hand, signaling them to stand down, but not leave. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice controlled, "you can't be here." "I don't care about your rules," she snapped. "I am your mother." "And this is my company," I replied. "You cannot walk onto the executive floor and demand access." She stormed past one officer before he could stop her and marched straight up to me. "You think you can treat us like this?" she hissed. "You think you can embarrass us in front of the entire business community?" "The truth embarrassed you," I said. "Not me." She pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "You owe us an explanation." "No," I said calmly. "I owe myself peace." She blinked, confusion, then hurt, then rage flickering across her face. "I didn't raise you to be cruel," she whispered. "No," I said. "You raised me to be quiet." Her eyes glistened. "We loved you. You loved the version of me that didn't challenge you." "That's not fair." "It's honest." She trembled, jaw tight, eyes glossy with a kind of disbelief that told me she truly, genuinely hadn't expected this. A daughter who refused to shrink. "I won't let this family fall apart," she said with quiet desperation. "That's not your decision," I replied, "and it's not my responsibility." Her shoulders slumped, but only for a moment. Then she straightened again, voice sharpening. "This isn't over, Morgan. Your father isn't done. Sienna isn't done. We will talk about this." I shook my head. "Not today." She exhaled sharply. "You've changed. I've grown." "And you think that's a good thing?" "I think," I said, "it's the first good thing I've done for myself." She turned away sharply and walked toward the elevator, shoulders rigid, steps furious. The officers escorted her silently. When the doors closed behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The corridor fell quiet again. Leah stepped forward carefully. "Do you want a moment?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." She left me alone. I walked slowly back into my office and stood in the center of the room. My mother's words replayed in my mind. "You owe us an explanation. You embarrassed us. You've changed. We loved you. We will talk about this." For 30 years, her voice had shaped my life. Her approval, her disappointment, her expectations. Today, her voice felt like something separate from me, something outside of my identity. For 30 years, I had twisted myself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into the spaces they allowed me. But now I was expanding, becoming, taking up space I had earned. I walked to the window, pressed my palm against the cool glass, and watched the city move, unbothered, unstoppable. I whispered the words aloud, letting them settle into the air. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." And for the first time in my memory, it was true. I stayed at the office late, long after most of the building had gone quiet. The sky outside had deepened to a blue so dark it almost looked like ink, and the city lights flickered beneath it like scattered fireflies. I should have gone home hours ago, but my mind wouldn't let me leave. Not after what happened with my mother, not with the weight of the company resting on my shoulders, not with the storm gathering outside my personal life. When I finally shut down my laptop, a hollow ache settled between my ribs. Not sadness exactly, not anger. Something more complex. Grief for a life I had tried to have, and relief that I no longer needed to pretend that life still existed. I left through the private elevator, descending into the underground parking structure. My footsteps echoed across the concrete as I walked toward my car, keys dangling loosely in my hand. The moment I unlocked the door, my phone buzzed again. Dozens of notifications, missed calls, voicemails. Family group chat blowing up. Unknown numbers, board messages. And then, one message that made my stomach go still. From Damon. "We need to talk, now." I clenched the phone in my hand. I almost ignored it. I wanted to ignore it. But the rational part of me knew it was better to face this head on. I typed one word back. "When?" His reply came instantly. "Now. Private conference room B12. I slid my phone into my coat pocket and locked the car again. My heels clicked sharply as I walked back toward the elevator. This time toward the floor most people didn't know existed. B12 was an old negotiation room from before the company expanded. Damon had no right to use it anymore. The fact that he did told me he wasn't thinking clearly. Good, let him be unsteady, let him show the cracks. The elevator door opened to a dim corridor, lit only by 2 overhead fixtures humming with age. When I reached the conference room, the door was closed. I knocked once, then pushed it open. Damon was pacing near the table, tie loosened, hair slightly out of place. He looked nothing like the polished, confident CEO who used to glide through gala events with a perfect smile. This version of him looked cornered. "Morgan," he said sharply, "shut the door." I did, slowly. "What is this about?" I asked. His eyes were dark with accusation. "You blindsided me. I warned you." "You didn't warn me," he snapped. "You humiliated me, in front of the board, in front of my team, in front of the entire company." "You humiliated yourself," I said. His jaw tightened. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you didn't plan this." "I didn't plan your actions. I just exposed them." He lunged toward the table and slapped a stack of papers down in front of me. "I got this from HR. Complaints, allegations, reports you dug up. You think this will stick?" "It already has." "You think you can unseat me?" he demanded. "You think the board will let you?" "I don't need the board's permission," I said. "I have majority control." His breath caught. For a moment something sharp flashed in his eyes. Fear or fury, I couldn't tell. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I won't." His expression twisted. "You don't understand how this works." I cut him off. "I built how this works." He stared at me, stunned, silent. I walked past him to the table, opened the folder he'd slapped down, and flipped through the pages without flinching. Every allegation, every buried complaint, every misconduct report. All of it stacked like evidence at a trial he didn't know he'd been on for years. "This is the culture you created," I said. "A culture where employees were afraid to speak, where women felt unsafe, where innovation died because people like you were more interested in optics than substance." His face reddened. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said. "I'm correcting everything." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "You couldn't handle being in the shadows, could you? You wanted the spotlight." I laughed, actual laughter that shocked even me. "You've never understood me at all." "What I understand," he spat, "is ambition." "You understand ego," I corrected. "Not ambition. Ambition builds. Ego destroys." His eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade. "You really think you can run this company better than me?" he asked. "I don't think," I said. "I know." His jaw flexed violently. "You're making enemies." "You were supposed to be my ally," I said calmly. He scoffed. "You didn't let anyone be your ally. You hid behind encrypted messages and secret votes. You set me up to fail." "You set yourself up," I said. "I gave you freedom. You abused it." His breathing grew shallow. "You're dangerous," he whispered. "Only to people who shouldn't be in power." He stared at me for a long moment, something volatile shifting behind his gaze. Then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "My wife was right," he said. "You're vindictive." "No," I said. "I'm done being silent." He grabbed the back of a chair and gripped it so tightly his knuckles cracked. "What happens now?" "You go on leave," I said. "HR conducts their investigation. The board reviews my appointments. The company stabilizes. And then we rebuild Luminex the right way." "And me?" he asked. I held his gaze. "That depends on the truth." He swallowed hard. "The truth is complicated." "No," I said. "The truth is simple. Your choices were complicated." He sank into a chair, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked young, overwhelmed, vulnerable in a way he'd spent years avoiding. "Was I really that bad?" he murmured. "Yes," I said honestly. "But that's not the whole story. You weren't always this man. You changed." "And you stayed the same?" he asked, looking up. I shook my head. "No, I grew." His eyes filled with something like resignation. "I don't know who I am without this job," he admitted quietly. "You'll have to learn," I said. "We all do at some point." He leaned back, exhaustion pulling at his expression. "Are you going to destroy me?" "I'm going to hold you accountable," I said. "What you do with that is up to you." For the first time since I'd walked into the room, he didn't fight. He just nodded slowly, defeated. "Do I still have a future at Luminex?" he asked. "That depends on the investigation," I said. "And on you." He looked down. "I messed up." "Yes," I said simply. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'll leave the building tonight. HR can contact me tomorrow." I nodded. "That's the right choice." He stood, straightened his tie, and headed toward the door. But before he left, he turned back. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first met you, I thought you were brilliant." I didn't respond. "And intimidating." Still nothing. "And now," his voice cracked, "now I understand why." He didn't wait for me to reply. He walked out, leaving the room hollow and heavy behind him. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. The confrontation had been necessary, brutal but necessary. I gathered the files from the table, stacked them neatly, and turned off the lights as I exited. By the time I reached my car again, the garage felt colder, the air harsher. I slid into the driver's seat and stared out the windshield, letting the quiet wrap around me. My phone buzzed again. A message from Kyle. Heard something happened tonight. Are you safe? I typed back. I'm okay, just tired. Another buzz. Want company? My breath caught. For a moment, I allowed myself the softness of the offer. Then I typed, not tonight, but thank you. I set the phone down, started the engine, and drove home through the darkened streets. Halfway home, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number this time. I shouldn't have answered. But I did. Morgan, my mother's voice cracked through the speaker, raw and frantic. Your father is furious. Sienna is in tears. Damon's wife is calling everyone. We need to fix this before it gets worse. I kept my eyes on the road. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You can't keep doing this, she snapped. I can, I said, and I will. You're destroying us. No, I said quietly. I'm freeing myself. Her breath hitched. We won't survive this. You already didn't, I whispered. You just didn't notice. I hung up before she could reply. When I reached my apartment, the exhaustion hit me all at once. Thick, heavy, bone deep. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the silence fill the spaces my family used to occupy. Today had taken everything from me, but it had also given me something I had never truly felt before. Sovereignty. And I wasn't about to give it back. I woke the next morning to a silence so crisp it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The light filtering through my curtains was soft, gray, cautious, like even the sun wasn't sure how the day would unfold. My body ached with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from emotional impact, from truths spoken out loud after decades of swallowing them whole. Still, the moment I sat up, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside my chest. Resolve, not anger, not fear, not defiance, just clarity. I showered, dressed, tied my hair back, and made a quiet breakfast I barely tasted. My phone buzzed over and over. My mother, my father, Sienna, 3 aunts, 1 cousin, my mother again. I placed the phone face down and left it that way. Today was about one thing, the contract. $2 billion. The largest deal in Luminex history, and the final step in solidifying the future I had built for myself, outside of the family that never cared, far beyond the shadow they kept insisting I stand in. By the time I got into my car, the city was fully awake. Traffic hummed through the streets, horns blaring, pedestrians jaywalking, coffee trucks steaming on corners. Life moved. My life moved. And I wasn't letting my family claw me back into their orbit ever again. At headquarters, the lobby buzzed with something almost electric. Heads turned as I entered, conversations hushed. Some people smiled, tentative, hopeful. Others watched me with wide eyes, uncertain what to expect from a founder they'd never met until yesterday. Leah rushed toward me the moment I stepped into the executive elevator. Morning, Miss Hayes. The Norrington delegation arrived early. They're waiting in the main conference suite. Are they nervous? I asked. She smiled faintly. No, they seem excited and relieved. Good. I stepped into the elevator alone, the doors closing with a soft thud. The ride up was smooth, silent, strangely grounding. For years I'd ridden this elevator as the quiet woman from research, or the operations auditor who kept to herself. No one ever suspected I was anything more. But today I would walk out of this elevator as the one person no one else in this building could outrank. The doors slid open, and I took a steady breath before walking into the corridor. Outside the conference suite, murmured voices carried through the crack beneath the door, low, polite, professional. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The entire room rose to their feet. Executives, lawyers, negotiators, analysts, the Norrington CEO himself. The energy shifted instantly. Respect, anticipation, focus. Miss Hayes, Charles Beaumont greeted warmly. Good to finally meet you in person. He extended his hand and I shook it firmly. Thank you for coming. We wouldn't miss it, he said. Your proposal was exceptional, visionary. A ripple of pride, quiet but real, moved through me. We sat, and the meeting began. For the first hour, we reviewed the predictive logistics framework I had coded years ago, the one that became the core of the Luminex platform. They asked questions. I answered clearly, precisely. Priya joined via video, providing integration details. The engineers from Norrington nodded along, jotting notes, visibly impressed. Then came the cost projection segment. Then the legal framework. Then the final clauses. Everything was moving smoothly until the conference door burst open without warning. The air snapped, and my breath stopped. My entire family walked in, my mother leading the charge, my father just behind her, Sienna trailing with a tight-chested fury written across her face. Behind them, 2 security officers followed, helpless, clearly unable to stop the storm that had just blown in. My mother's eyes were red, her makeup smudged. "Morgan," she said loudly, voice trembling. "We need to speak to you, right now." The entire room froze. Charles Beaumont straightened, jaw tightening. "Excuse me, this is a private negotiation." My father stepped forward. "We're her family." "This is urgent." "No," I said calmly. "It's not." Sienna scoffed. "You can't ignore us." "I can," I said. "And I am." My mother took a shaky step closer. "How dare you humiliate us like this? How dare you shut us out? We deserve to be part of this." I kept my voice level. "You deserve nothing from this room." "You listen to me," my father snapped. "You are going to fix what you broke. You are going to repair this family, or—" "I'm in the middle of a negotiation," I said sharply. "A negotiation that affects thousands of employees and billions of dollars. This is not the place for your theatrics." Sienna pointed a trembling finger at me. "You think you're better than us now? You think money makes you important?" "No," I said. "I think work does. Integrity does. And neither of you taught me that." My mother's lip quivered. "We are your family." I looked at her with a clarity that cut through my chest. "And I needed you," I said softly. "I needed you for 30 years. You never showed up. You showed up now because you're scared." She went still. "You're scared of losing access, scared of losing control, scared of losing the daughter you didn't care about until she became useful." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't waver. "You don't get to storm into my workplace," I said. "Not today, not ever again." My father's face reddened. "We raised you." "You raised a ghost," I said. "One that learned to walk through walls because you refused to open a door." The room was silent. Completely, absolutely silent. I let out a steady breath. "Security," I said calmly. "Please escort them out." My mother gasped. "You wouldn't." "I would," I said. "And I am." The officers stepped forward, gentle but firm. My family resisted, pleading, arguing, demanding. But within moments they were removed from the room. The door closed softly behind them, the latch clicking like a period at the end of a sentence I should have written years ago. I turned back to the room. Every eye was on me. I straightened my shoulders. "My apologies for the interruption. We can continue." Charles leaned forward slowly. "Miss Hayes, is everything all right?" "No," I said, "but it will be." He nodded with quiet respect. "Then let's finalize this together." For the next hour, the meeting resumed with a renewed sense of gravity. When it came time to sign the final document, Charles pushed the folder toward me and offered a pen. "Founder's signature goes first." I took the pen. The moment ink touched the page, something changed inside me. Not a spark, not a fire, but the quiet click of a lock opening. A door I had spent decades banging on from the outside finally swung inward, and I walked through. After the meeting ended, handshakes and congratulations filled the room. People smiled at me, not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. I stepped into the hallway, took a breath, and allowed myself one moment to sink into the realization. I didn't just survive my past. I outgrew it. I rebuilt myself. I reclaimed what was always mine. And now, no one, family or otherwise, could take it from me again. But as I headed toward my office, my phone buzzed with a new notification. A message from my father. "We're not done." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed, "I am," and walked into the rest of my life. I didn't go back to my office after signing the contract. My body carried me there out of habit. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, the air felt too thick, my thoughts too crowded, the fluorescent lights too sharp. I needed space. I needed air. I needed a moment where I wasn't surrounded by glass walls, hushed voices, or the ghost of my family's intrusion still clinging to my skin like smoke. So instead of turning right toward the executive suite, I turned left, walked straight to the private elevator, and descended to the street-level atrium. People moved around me in a blur, employees clutching coffee cups, visitors checking in at the front desk, security guards nodding politely as I passed. But none of them existed long enough in my vision to register. My body felt detached, almost foreign, like I was moving underwater. Outside, the crisp afternoon air met my face with a sharpness that made my lungs expand in relief. Cars buzzed along the boulevard, horns honking, pedestrians weaving through each other with practiced urgency. For a moment, I simply stood there at the edge of the sidewalk, letting the city swallow the remnants of my family's voices still echoing in my head. "Morgan, you owe us an explanation." "You embarrassed us." "We won't survive this." "You've changed." Changed, yes. But they never understood that change was the only thing that had kept me alive all these years. My phone buzzed, dragging me back to the present. I pulled it out, expecting another barrage of messages from my parents or Sienna, but instead I saw a different name flash across the screen. Kyle. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. We hadn't spoken since yesterday. Not really. Just a brief conversation before he walked out of my office and left me with a reminder of who I used to be. A reminder of who had believed in me long before family or title or power entered the picture. His message was simple. "Outside your building. Thought you might need company." For the first time all day, something inside me softened. I typed back, "At Luminex. Need 10 minutes. His reply was instant. "I'll wait." I tucked my phone into my coat pocket and began walking. The city pulsed around me, loud and chaotic, exactly what I needed. I let the movement steady me, my boots tapping against the concrete with each step, my breath gradually sinking to the rhythm of the world instead of the frantic beat inside my chest. When I reached my building, Kyle was leaning against one of the marble pillars near the entrance, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. He looked up the moment he sensed me approaching. "You okay?" he asked. I exhaled. "No, but I'm functional." His lips curved faintly. "Functional is better than falling apart." I walked closer until I stood directly in front of him. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said. "That's why I did." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was grounding. Kyle had always known how to sit with me in quiet spaces, long before either of us had titles or money or reputations to manage. "You look like you've been through a war," he said softly. "I have. And I won." He gave a slow, impressed nod. "Of course you did." We walked inside, past the doorman who gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and surprise, as though my mother's visit had turned into building gossip. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, but it wasn't tense. If anything, it felt like I was finally letting oxygen back into the parts of my lungs that had forgotten how to expand. When we stepped into my apartment, Kyle paused just inside the door, scanning the space as if memorizing it. He'd been here before, but never like this. Never when the air was thick with the aftershock of a family earthquake big enough to shake loose every buried memory. "Want tea?" I asked. "Only if you're getting some?" I set water on the stove, pulled down 2 mugs, and leaned against the counter as steam began to rise. Kyle stood across from me, arms folded, watching with that steady intensity that always made me feel strangely seen. "What happened?" he finally asked. Everything, I sighed. And nothing new. Your family came to the contract meeting? They stormed it. He winced. Damn. They barged into a negotiation room full of executives and partners, demanding explanations, shouting about reputation, accusing me of betrayal. Kyle shook his head. You handled it? I escorted them out. He looked proud for a second, then concerned. How are you holding up? I stared at the boiling water. They keep saying I've changed, as if that's the worst thing imaginable. It terrifies them, he said softly. You outgrew the shape they built for you. I swallowed hard. I spent years trying to earn their approval. Now it feels like I finally understand that I was never supposed to. Tea finished steeping. We carried the mugs to the living room, settling onto opposite ends of the couch. For a while we sat quietly, the city humming beneath the windows. Then Kyle leaned forward. You know what I remember the most about you? He asked. I raised an eyebrow. This should be good. He smiled faintly. I remember sitting in that tiny basement office at 2 a.m, watching you explain your routing algorithm on a whiteboard like your life depended on every line of code. I remember thinking, she's going to change the world and no one will see it coming. A lump formed in my throat. You always believed in me more than anyone. That's because you made it easy, he said. You worked harder than anyone I'd ever seen. You were relentless. Sometimes it felt like I had to be, I whispered. Kyle nodded. Because you were carrying more than code. You were carrying everything your family couldn't see. I stared at him for a long moment, letting his words sink through the layers of armor I'd built around myself. Do you think I did the right thing? Exposing everything? Taking control? I don't think, he said. I know. But what if this tears everything apart? He met my eyes. Some things deserve to fall apart. The honesty loosened something inside me, and before I could stop them, memories I'd buried for decades began surfacing. My mother once told me I was too independent, I said quietly, that if I didn't soften myself, no man would ever want me. She said it like she was offering advice. Kyle's jaw tightened. That wasn't advice. That was fear. Of what? Of you not needing them. I stared into my tea. My father always said family comes first, but that never included me unless they needed something. Kyle leaned closer. Families that want control don't love equally. They love conditionally. The words hit hard. Yesterday he said if I leave the family I shouldn't expect to come back. And how did that feel? He asked. I breathed out slowly. Like relief. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Kyle reached out and touched my hand, just briefly, but the gesture grounded me more than anything had in days. You're not alone, Morgan, he said, even when they try to make you feel like you are. I held his gaze. Thank you. We talked for hours, about the company, about the contract, about what would come next. When he finally left, the apartment felt different. Not empty, not haunted, but mine, completely mine. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat cross-legged on the couch, staring out at the glittering city below. The steam from my tea floated upward like faint whispers, soft and warm against the cool air. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my mother. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Sienna. It was Leah. Miss Hayes, something happened downstairs. You need to come back to HQ now. A cold jolt shot down my spine. I replied instantly, What's going on? Her answer came seconds later. Damon. He didn't go home. I was already grabbing my coat. Something inside me knew this wasn't going to be another quiet confrontation. Not this time. This time would be different. This time, the fallout would affect everything. By the time I reached Luminex headquarters, the sky had darkened into a heavy indigo curtain, the kind that usually promised either rain or trouble. Judging by Leah's message, trouble had already arrived. I parked crookedly, not caring, and jogged toward the private employee entrance, swiping my badge with more force than needed. The lock clicked open, The hallway lights flickered on, and a strange hush washed over me. A hush charged with tension. Leah was pacing near the end of the corridor, her tablet clutched to her chest. When she saw me, relief and fear washed over her face in equal measure. "Miss Hayes, thank God," she whispered, hurrying toward me. "He's still here." "Where?" I asked. "Conference room 3. Security didn't want to force him out until you arrived." I steadied my breathing. "Did he say why?" She swallowed. "He said he found something." My pulse quickened. "Found what?" "He wouldn't tell us." "Of course not. Damon would never reveal a card unless he thought it could burn me alive." I nodded. "Stay here, and don't let anyone else in." Leah hesitated. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" "Yes," I said. "He's my responsibility." That was only half the truth. Damon wasn't just my responsibility, he was also the last remnant of a system I had allowed to rot. And if that system was going down, I needed to ensure it didn't take the company with it. I squared my shoulders and walked down the hallway, each step echoing like a countdown. At the conference room, I placed my hand on the handle and paused. For a moment, I considered the possibility that Damon had snapped. That grief over his fading career had twisted into desperation, that he might try something unhinged. Then I inhaled and opened the door. The lights were dimmed. Only a single lamp glowed near the window, casting long shadows across the room. Damon stood at the far end of the table holding a stack of folders. Not the ones I had shown him earlier, different ones, older, thicker. His tie was loosened, his eyes bloodshot, and his posture slumped in a way I had never seen. Not arrogant, not confident, just beaten. Yet there was something else in his eyes, too, something sharper, something close to dangerous clarity. "You came," he said softly. "You asked," I replied. He laughed once, a low, bitter sound. "You always were good at answering what mattered." I stepped forward carefully. "Damon, what's going on?" He held up a folder. "I found these in the old archives." My throat tightened. That room, Archive A, held every piece of the company's beginning. Coding logs, prototype schematics, early board decisions, financial restructuring from year 1. "What's in them?" I asked. He set the stack on the table and flipped one open. "Your work." I froze. He continued. "Your handwriting, your code, your drafts, your plans, your projections, your signatures, all dated years before I ever even walked into this company." I didn't move. Couldn't. He stared at me, eyes hollow. "You really did build everything." My fingers curled slightly. "I told you that." He shook his head. "I didn't believe you. Not fully. Not until I saw these." I stepped closer, but cautiously. "Damon," he lifted another document. "Your name was everywhere, and yet you erased it from every public record." "That was intentional." "Hiding your identity?" he asked. "Or hiding from your family?" My jaw clenched. He smirked faintly. "I figured as much." "Damon," I said, voice steady, "why are you showing me this?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because I thought I could bury you the way I buried everything else that threatened my position. I thought if I dug up something, anything, I could use it to push you back into the shadows." "And?" I asked quietly. "And I didn't find your weakness," he whispered. "I found your truth." He lifted his gaze, and for the first time there was no arrogance, no charm, no deflection. Just raw understanding. "You were never trying to take the company from me," he said. "You were trying to save it." "Yes," I said. "I still am." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "I messed up." "I know. I crossed lines." "You did." "I hurt people." "You did," I repeated. He met my eyes. "Including you." Something inside me tightened. I didn't need the apology, but hearing it mattered more than I expected. He stepped back and gestured to the stack. "These prove you were the founder. They prove everything you said. They prove this company was yours before anyone else touched it. I thought I'd find something to use against you, but all I found was why you deserved better leadership." I studied him carefully. "What do you want, Damon?" He swallowed. "I want to know if there's a place for me here." The vulnerability in his voice, unexpected, unguarded, caught me off guard. I breathed in slowly. "You're under investigation. You know that." "I know," he said, "and I'll accept whatever comes. But before that, I needed you to know I'm done fighting you." My shoulders eased ever so slightly. "Then stop sabotaging yourself." He nodded. "I will." A beat of silence passed. Then he added, almost quietly, "And I needed to tell you something else. Something I didn't understand until today." My heartbeat picked up. "What?" He held my gaze, steady and solemn. "You're not like me. You're not like any of them. You're not leading from ego. You're leading because you built a world worth protecting." "Damon." "You're more capable than I ever gave you credit for," he said. "And you deserved credit long before today." The words sank into me like sunlight reaching a place starved for warmth. He took another step back, raising his hand slightly. "I'm going to leave now. I won't cause trouble. I won't fight the process. I won't fight you." "Thank you," I said quietly. He gathered his coat but paused at the door. "For what it's worth. I'm sorry. Truly." He left before I could answer. The room felt strangely still, as though something large had finally exhaled. I walked to the table and opened the folder on top. My handwriting stared back at me in looping lines of notes, early algorithms scribbled in rushed script, documentation from all-nighters I barely remembered. Pages of proof. Proof that I had always been more than the invisible daughter. More than the silent founder. More than the woman people assumed wasn't worth noticing. I closed the folder gently, then my phone buzzed. A new message, not from Damon, from my father. "We're coming to your apartment. This ends tonight." Cold pressure tightened around my ribs. I texted back, "Do not show up. I won't let you in." No reply. Another message arrived seconds later, this time from my mother. "Please, don't do this." And then Sienna. "You've ruined everything. If you lock us out again, don't expect a family." I turned the phone over, face down, pulse quickening. The door behind me creaked open again, softly this time. I turned sharply, adrenaline spiking. But it wasn't my family. It was Priya. Her expression changed instantly when she saw the stacks of documents, the look on my face, the tension in my shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, hurrying toward me. I swallowed the storm threatening to break inside me. "Damon found the old archives." "And?" "And he knows everything." "About you?" "Yes." "And about your family?" I nodded slowly. She glanced at the folder, then at me. "Morgan, what did he say?" I took a breath. "He said he's done fighting." Priya exhaled in relief. "Good, that's good." But my gaze drifted to my phone. She followed my line of sight, saw the messages, her jaw tightening. "They're coming," I said. "No," she whispered. "Not again." I straightened, gathering the folders, stuffing them into my bag with efficient precision. "This time," I said, "I won't be there." Priya reached for my arm. "What are you going to do?" I lifted my bag, feeling the weight of my past and future both anchored inside it. "Finish what I started." I walked out of the conference room, each step carrying me deeper into determination. My phone buzzed again. One final message from my father. "We won't be ignored." But I didn't even look down. Because for the first time in my life, their voices couldn't touch me. Not anymore. The elevator hummed softly as it carried me toward the executive floor for the final time that week, each passing number tightening the resolve in my chest. I held the leather folder against my ribs as though anchoring myself to something solid, something that couldn't be bent by blood or guilt or nostalgia. Outside the glass shaft, the city glowed with early morning gold, its towers sharp against the horizon like rows of sharpened blades. For a moment I watched the sunlight spill across the skyline and thought about how different today felt. How different I felt. This was the morning everything would be set in place. The restructuring, the disciplinary actions, the ethical overhaul, and, if necessary, the final severing of ties that had been fraying for years. When the doors opened, Priya was already waiting with a tablet in hand, her hair in a tight bun, her expression composed but worried. "They tried to come up," she said. My stomach stiffened. "When?" 20 minutes ago. Security turned them away at the lobby." She hesitated. "Your mother argued." "Of course she did." "Your sister cried." I breathed in slowly. "And my father?" Priya met my gaze. "He said he wouldn't leave without speaking to you." A small, cold part of me flinched, but I nodded. "They won't get through today." "No," Priya said firmly. "Not on my watch." We walked together toward the boardroom. The walls were decorated with framed innovations from the last decade: algorithm models, patent certificates, photographs of product launches, each one a silent reminder of what I had built. The people who walked past us whispered quietly, their respect sharper now, more conscious, as if realizing they were watching history write itself. I pushed the door open and stepped into the boardroom. Everyone was already seated: the executives, the department heads, the ethics advisors flown in overnight, the new compliance attorney I hired, and at the far end of the table, Damon, calm, quiet, and surprisingly composed. He stood when I entered. So did everyone else. "Good morning," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Good morning," echoed back around the room, a chorus of voices tight with anticipation. I placed the leather folder in front of me and opened it. Inside were the documents that would finalize everything. The policies I had rewritten, the accountability measures, the suspensions, the new oversight protocols. This was the moment I had been preparing for without even knowing it. "We'll begin," I said. The first hour was procedural. I outlined the structural changes, the department reassignment, the elimination of the toxic chain of promotion that had dominated the company culture. Several board members asked questions, but they weren't challenging me. They were seeking clarity, understanding the weight of the reforms. When we reached the agenda item labeled Investigatory Conclusions Regarding Senior Staff, the room stiffened. I turned toward Damon. He met my eyes. No anger, no defensiveness, only acceptance. "By the recommendations of the legal and compliance teams," I said, "we have concluded that your actions over the last 3 years, including suppression of internal complaints, manipulation of advancement processes, and misallocation of resources, constitute violations of company policy." He nodded once. "Understood. However," I continued, "you have also cooperated fully with the investigation, relinquished all attempts to influence the outcome, and provided substantial assistance in correcting the damage." He inhaled shakily. "Therefore," I said, "we recommend reassignment, mandatory training, and a period of monitored probation, not termination." A ripple moved across the room. Surprise, relief, respect. Damon closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet but steady. "Thank you." "This is not charity," I said. "This is accountability, and a chance to rebuild." "I won't waste it," he whispered. We moved on. Name by name, we reviewed the findings. Those who had done real harm were dismissed. Those who had been complicit were reprimanded. Those who had been silenced were given a platform. And for the first time in this company's history, every person in that room looked toward me not as a shadow, not as an unknown authority, not as a rumor with power, but as a leader. When the final decision was signed, Priya handed me my tablet with the last document cued. "The company-wide announcement," she murmured. I tapped the screen. A broadcast opened, transmitting across every floor, every office, every satellite building, every remote workstation. "Good morning, everyone," I said. "Today marks a turning point." I outlined the reforms, the values, the expectations, the new culture we would uphold, and the promise that every voice would matter. Then I added something I hadn't planned. I built this company because I wanted to create something where excellence mattered more than privilege, where effort mattered more than connections, where fairness wasn't negotiable. And as of today, that is the future of Luminex. When I ended the broadcast, the room was silent. Then applause broke out, soft at first, then stronger. It wasn't loud, it wasn't thunderous, it was respectful. When the meeting adjourned, people filtered out quietly, some approaching to offer thanks or reassurance. Damon stopped near me. "You saved me," he said softly. "No," I replied, closing my folder. "You saved yourself by choosing truth over pride." He nodded once, deeply, then left. Priya lingered. "Now," she said, "you have one more thing to do." I sighed. My family. Yes. I walked to my office, each step slow, the calm before a storm that wasn't mine to put out anymore. When I entered, I saw a notification blinking on my security console. Lobby, 4 individuals requesting access. Denied, 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 denied. I pressed the intercom. Patch them to the visitor conference room. 2 minutes later, I entered the small, neutral-colored meeting space, where so many investor negotiations had once taken place. My mother stood. "Morgan." My father stiffened. "You can't keep shutting us out." Sienna's mascara was smudged. "You're our sister." My mother reached forward. "We love you." I remained standing near the entrance. "Then listen carefully." They quieted. "Today's decisions are final. My role at this company is not up for negotiation. My life is not up for negotiation. And neither are my boundaries." My father scowled. "Boundaries? We're family." "Yes," I said, "and for 30 years you mistook that for ownership." Sienna shook her head. "Why are you doing this? Why are you choosing strangers over us?" "I'm choosing myself," I said, "for the first time." My mother's voice broke. "We didn't know you were hurting. You didn't want to know." My father stepped forward. "You owe us respect." "I owe you honesty," I said. "And here's mine. There will be no conversation today about restoring your influence in my life or this company." My mother's lips trembled. "So you're abandoning us?" "No," I said. "I'm letting you face the consequences of your own choices." Their faces shifted. Hurt, anger, fear. The same cycle every time they realized control was slipping. But I didn't bend. I didn't break. I simply inhaled and exhaled. And then I said the words that had taken me a lifetime to find. "I will speak to you again when you're ready to see me as a person. Not a disappointment, not a convenience, not a resource. Until then, this is goodbye." My mother covered her mouth as tears fell. My father stared at me like I'd committed treason. Sienna whispered something like a prayer or a curse. I reached for the door handle. "Morgan!" my mother cried. But I didn't turn around. I left. And the door clicked shut behind me. That evening, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city. The sun dipped low, turning the skyline into molten glass. The breeze carried the scent of rain, of endings, of beginnings. For the first time in years, my chest didn't feel tight. For the first time in years, my reflection didn't look like a woman trying to disappear. I looked like someone stepping into her own life without permission from anyone else. I sipped my tea, felt the warmth spread through my palms, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm free." And if you've been here, listening to my story from beginning to end, thank you. If any part of my journey reminded you of your own, or gave you strength, or made you feel less alone, share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear your story too, and if you want more stories like this, about justice, resilience, and taking back your power, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Now, let's keep going, together.